All right, it's the top of the hour, and welcome to Gray Associates 2022 Community College Bootcamp Series, when we are looking at academic program evaluation for community colleges. Today is Class 1. It's on labor market data, and we're extremely excited to have Michael Voss from Mesa Community College with us today, along with our CEO, Robert Atkins. Before we get started, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of our Zoom meeting here. We will that allows people to upvote them, and we'll try to answer them in the order they're received. If you have any comments or have any technical difficulties, please do not hesitate to drop them into the chat. We will have a poll at the end. We always like feedback on how we're doing with these type of courses and offerings. So please take a few minutes and fill out 2 very quick questions. Without further ado, I will hand it off and turn it over to Bob.
Thank you very much, Ned, and welcome everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your day to come join us. I am Bob Atkins. I'm the CEO of Gray and the proud author of the book Stop, Start, or Grow, which just came out actually in May, so it's pretty fresh off the presses. Some of what you're hearing today are actually concepts that we developed and then documented really in the book, which can help you all as a guide to how to do program analysis in addition to the series that we're about to teach. So feel free to get that. It's on Amazon under Stop, Start, or Grow. Now, let's take a look. This particular webinar series it's going to cover 4 topics. Today is labor market data. Then we'll touch on student demand and competition on August 11th. Then we do economics on the 18th. And finally, management and implementation of an updated program evaluation process, which we'll cover on August 25th. Today, obviously, I'm here with you. I'm the founder and CEO at Gray. Mike, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Michael Voss. I'm one of the deans of instruction at Mesa Community College. I oversee the applied science, business, CIS, and justice studies area. And we've been with Gray as a publicly funded community college, kind of as soon as it was available to do so. So glad to be here and share what we know and how we use the system.
That's right, one of our founding users. I'd forgotten that, Mike. So let's take a look at what we're going to talk about. First, we'll talk about what a program evaluation system is and isn't. Then I'll go through some things that you run into when you try and do this on your own and evaluate the jobs available for your graduates. And there's some real stumbling blocks there. Then we'll share current data on labor markets and what's hot and what's not. And then I'll hand it off to Mike, and he'll discuss how they've used this sort of concept at Mesa. And then finally, we'll touch on what's coming next. So, I guess there's a question, do you even need data for labor market data for program evaluation? And the answer, of course, is yes. You need it to understand what the high demand occupations are in your market so you can support your local community and employers. You need to prioritize programs for your students so that they land good jobs when they graduate. And importantly, and often overlooked to some extent, you need to be able to look at that data and find the skills that are actually needed in the job market so that you can be sure that they're being taught in your curriculum. And given the speed of change in our job markets these days, keeping that up to date is a challenge. So that's another important use of labor market data. One point I really want to make, though, is keep in mind, labor market systems are not program evaluation systems. They're a component of a program evaluation system. In fact, to be more precise, they're a component of one part of a program evaluation system. So what the devil is a program evaluation system? Well, it's data, it's software, and actually, importantly, it's people and process as well. What kind of information do you need? In the center of this diagram, you see we need information about the mission, and does this program align with the mission? We need to keep track of whether the program is consistent with our academic standards and the degree levels that we choose to teach. We then need to turn to markets and say, is there a market for this program? And that's where labor market data kicks in. One aspect of a market is labor, another is student demand and competition. So that's, again, out of the market side. And then all that stuff ripples back through and affects the margins of the program. And while none of us are in the institutions on this phone or probably in for-profit colleges, margins are still important because high margin programs are needed to subsidize lower margin programs and to fund the mission of the institution. Last but not least, this is not entirely a numbers game. To do this well, you have to involve the right people in a fair, open process where they can contribute and have their voice heard. Otherwise, you create all kinds of acrimony on campus that'll actually slow down your implementation of new programs and your ability to update your program portfolio. Now, I mentioned employment's one part of this. I don't want to skip over it. We're going to talk about it today. But as you can see, even within markets, there are several other dimensions that are important. Student demand is one. What do students want? How's that trending? Competition, who is it? How much is it? And importantly, is the market already saturated? Which, by the way, is very independent of how many competitors there are, or even how many students there are. Some of the biggest programs in the United States actually are not super competitive, and others that are smaller are. So you really have to look at saturation indexes there. And we'll talk about that in a subsequent webinar. And finally, degree fit. Is this the right level of degree for my campus? We don't want to give PhDs in house painting, and we don't want to be doing neurosurgery as an associate's program. So you do have to look at that and decide if the program's a good fit for the type of degree that you're set up to offer. Now let's turn to the data itself. There are a lot of sources for labor market data. Lightcast, which used to be MC and Burning Glass, is one. You can go directly to job sites on the internet like Glassdoor and Monster and Indeed. You can look at things like LinkedIn. And all of those will have jobs. Each of those data sources has its own issues. And as you go through them, you're going to want to pause and really try and understand what the strengths and weaknesses are of the source that you're using. So for example, if you're looking at a job board, they have a bias to leave jobs up after there are no jobs. So just be aware of that and check the date and make sure that what you're looking at is reasonably current. And that's surprisingly tricky to do because sometimes jobs are left up because yes, they may have hired somebody, but they actually wanted to hire 5 people. So it'll be on that board for a while. So as I say, keep that in mind. And the second problem we have with people who process labor market data off sites like Indeed is deduping. You'll often find the same job posting several times by geography. You may also find it several times within a given employer, and you need to be able to go in and figure out when that's a dupe and when it's actually a second job. So that's an important challenge, and all of the folks, including us, who process labor market data, really have to deal with that and make sure that they're only reporting one job once. The other problem we have, and I don't know if anybody solved this, is there are many jobs that are in fact posted as one job, but actually people are hiring more than one person. So if you're looking at RNs for a hospital, they may have one job posted and they may need 5 RNs. If this is a particular issue with some public service jobs, teachers in state systems, for example, the state will often post one job when they need a dozen math teachers. So there are some issues here, not all of them we've solved, but just be aware of them so you don't misestimate what the opportunities are. At least you understand where there's, in effect, risk to your estimate of how many jobs are available to your grad. Now, there's some other kind of more fundamental fallacies in here that you can actually clean up. Now, one of these is what's called a sip to sock crosswalk. Now, I always think of that as a sound of, me walking through the mud in boots, we go sip, sock. But a SIP is a classification of instructional program, or for all of us, that's the definition of an academic program. That's how we all report them into what's called IPEDS, the federal database that holds all completions in the United States. A SOC is an occupation code, and the shorthand here is a SIP is not a SOC. Academic program is not a job. It's not an occupation. So somehow or other, you have to figure out how to figure out which programs lead to which jobs. And that is not a trivial undertaking. Many people go and look at what's called the NCES crosswalk, National Center for Education Statistics crosswalk. The crosswalk presumes that people do what they've been trained to do. So as an example, diagnostic medical sonographers would go into 2 fields according to NCES. Predictably enough, diagnostic medical sonographer and health specialties post-secondary teachers, presumably teaching diagnostic medical sonography. That makes sense. Construction engineering tech, they become construction managers, cost estimators, and civil engineering technicians. Again, it all looks pretty clear and pretty sensible. When you get to liberal arts, it starts to be a little less sensible. And I think this permeates other areas, though at the associate's level, we haven't found a really good source that will tell us what do associate's graduates actually do on the occupational side. I would assume, for simplicity, that for all your transfer programs, they're going to end up doing what they would get as they move up to a 4-year degree, and we'll come back to that. But in history, I'm a history major, so I have to admit I take personal offense at this, but They think we're only good for becoming tour guides, historians, managers, other, perhaps my favorite, and teachers in post-secondary ed. So that's 5 jobs. I don't think you can find a job on there that earns the median wage in the United States. And if that were true, it'd be a real problem for people like me. But there is this little thing. This is taken directly off the NCS Crosswalk site. And it says the crosswalk, the SIPSOC crosswalk, is not based on actual empirical data. I'm not sure what kind of data is not empirical, but this basically says it's not based on data at all. It is, in fact, based on the judgment of the labor market economists in Washington about what people are trained to do with a degree and what fields are addressable by them. Now, when you look at history, all bets are off. They said we go into 5 fields. Well, it turns out when you look at the American Community Survey, which is a subset of the US Census, 2.5 million people surveyed, history majors actually don't go into just 5 fields. They go into 502 fields. So they're only off by a little. You have to multiply by 100 to get from what they say to what reality is. Now, they did get a few of the jobs that are in the top 10 for history majors. The middle school teachers, post-secondary teachers, manager, other is there, secondary school teacher, but then we become education administrators. Within our top 10, we become CEOs. We become retail salespeople, not the best outcome we would hope for. We also become management analysts, retail supervisors. Some of us go on into the clergy and some remain customer service reps. But the biggest single field is we go into grad school and become lawyers. And as a result, the earnings for history majors are at the 80th percentile for the US for $106,000. So stories you often hear, what are you going to do with a history major? There are no jobs for people like that. Fundamentally counterfactual. It's just not true. History majors do have jobs. This is true for many people in the liberal arts. There are jobs for them. And it's interesting, I won't take you through it all today, but the jobs people do are actually quite different from one major to another, even though they're all liberal arts and they're not trained for anything specific. But English graduates don't actually go into the same programs as history majors, or the same jobs as history majors, nor do psych grads. And the earnings are actually quite different across those 3 groups as well. So there are real differences in what people go on to do, but none of those differences are particularly associated with the NCS crosswalk and what they're directly prepared to do. And my hypothesis is that at least within 3 to 5 years of graduation, many people who study for a very particular occupation like diagnostic medical sonography may in fact find themselves in another field 3 to 5 years down the road for a variety of reasons. The job market shrinks, they decide they're not interested, they change towns. So keep that in mind. This idea of direct prep is a bit of a myth. How much of a myth? Well, we looked at 896 programs. Now, in fairness, this is for bachelor's programs. 896 out of 1,061 programs we analyzed, less than 20% of people went into the field for which they were directly prepared. So 90% of our data, only 20% of the people that graduated from those did what they were trained to do. That's going to be less true for your associates, your trades graduates. This is primarily going to be true for your transfer students. Next problem is what we call a many-to-one problem. Most of the time when you're doing analysis, particularly of a new program, you're looking at one program opportunity at a time. And people will say, okay, let's imagine that you're deciding to offer a business, whether or not to offer a business program. Someone will go out and say, okay, well, what jobs are available to business graduates? And they'll probably use the NCS crosswalk. In any case, you'd look at it and say, well, there are jobs for CEOs. And let's assume for a moment there are 100 jobs for CEOs. And you come back proudly, I have to say, as we used to 5, 6 years ago, and say, okay, there are 100 jobs for my business graduates. Unfortunately, they're not the only people trying to get those CEO jobs. So if you did a study on business and accounting and history at the same time, your accounting guy would come back and say, oh, I got 100 CEO jobs for my accountants. And remember, history grads become CEOs too. So the history guy would come back and say, well, I got 100 CEO jobs for my history majors. And what you would have effectively done is tripled the number of jobs available as CEOs in the course of your analysis. It would be wonderful if we could create jobs that way. We ran a computer overnight once, is how we found this out. And we were looking at all programs. And we started out with the jobs available in the United States. And in the morning, we tripled the number of jobs available in the United States. Obviously, that's not how the world really works. So you have to go through a pretty complex process looking at all the programs offered out there and allocate the jobs to the programs that are competing for those jobs, so that you don't give 100 to everybody. And spreading that out is actually fairly complex to do, but very important. Otherwise, you're just fundamentally overestimating the opportunity for your graduates. Now, I'm bearer of bad news this morning, but the other problem you have is that predictions, and they are hard to make, as Yogi Berra said, especially about the future. I will modify that. It's actually very easy to make predictions. I can do it here while we're talking. Unfortunately, it's hard to make accurate predictions. And most of you are probably looking at something like the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics forecast, to try and estimate how many jobs are going to be out there for your graduates in the future. Which programs should you invest in because they're in growing areas? And I have to say, this is troublesome. When we back tested the Bureau of Labor Statistics forecasts, we found that 82% of them were off by 50% or more. Now, be careful. We're not saying that they misestimated the total number of people employed in a field by 50%. That's not the case. But they missed the growth estimates by 50%. So if a field was supposed to grow 1%, it was just as likely to grow 0% or 2%. So it's that growth estimate that they didn't get right. And that's very difficult because you're not trying to predict 100% employment. You're trying to predict that last little tail of 5, 6, 7% growth, which is pretty challenging. And I honestly don't blame BLS for not being able to do this. It's fundamentally impossible. You're looking at 700 occupation codes in an environment as complex as the US economy. It's affected by everything from wars in foreign countries to plagues to simple economic cycles and technological change. In the midst of all that, it's extremely difficult to estimate what's going to be happening 5 to 10 years out. But let's hope they can at least get the sign right. They can tell us what's growing and what's not. Unfortunately, that's not true either. You'd be just as well off flipping a coin to try and figure out what's going to grow or shrink as looking at the BLS forecast. So if we looked in a little bit more depth here, if we flipped coins and it came up heads, tails, that would be, say, growth, not growth. We get that about 25% of the time of the coin. We do better here. When we forecasted negative and it was actually positive, that only happens 10% of the time. So BLS is unlikely to overestimate the number of shrinking programs. In the middle, where it gets the same sign, that'd be 50-50. About half the time it's going to go up heads, tails, heads and heads, or tails and tails if it's a coin. So that'd be 50-50. Well, we do a little bit better. We get up to 62% with BLS. But that's not a heck of a big improvement when you're trying to make $1 million bet on which lab to build on your campus. And then most worrisome, BLS's bias is to forecast things that are going to be positive that actually turn out to be negative. And they're a little worse than a coin toss, with 27% of the time making that mistake. So even if you're trying to figure out just what's going to grow and what's going to shrink, this is not a great source. Now, many of you know how to work around this, and Mike will talk about it a little bit more, but in a community college, it pays to stay very close to your local employers and understand what they're doing. And the second thing that I think is really important is a fast response. Now, to have a fast response, you actually have to know what's going on in your local market and have that data quickly enough. And then you have to have the operational flexibility to change what you're teaching relatively quickly so you can address what's changed in the marketplace. Because you're not really going to be able to forecast it very well. So now let's turn to what's actually hot right now. And first things first, job postings. And I'm sure all of you have been reading about this in the papers. This is one of the fastest growing job markets we've seen in decades. A lot of that is bounce coming out of COVID. So you can see back here in March, the black lines are 2020. We were down around 20,000 job postings a month. And then COVID happened and it got all the way down to about 14,000. And then as COVID eased up, we bounced back and we just kept bouncing up really until we hit a peak, actually about a year ago in August, these light blue lines. And it's been starting to come back down again on the light blue lines. In the last 3 months coming up through May, it was actually down month over month for that period. Let's look at the dark green bars. That's this year. So you see it coming down. We bounced up a little bit in June, a month over month, we're still down 45% year over year versus last year. So that's a big decline. On the other hand, we're 29% higher than we were in what I'll call last normal month pre-COVID, May 2020. So it's still a very hot job market. Perhaps the Fed's moves and the recession will slow that down a little bit, but it's hard to see any sign that it's going to go back to levels that we're accustomed to in a quote normal economy. So I think this is still very strong and may persist, but I'm not going to try and make a prediction because I'm not going to do any better than anybody else. Now, what's actually happening? Again, you can probably see the trend here. This axis is growth, and the x-axis, the horizontal, is how big the program is. And these are jobs available to our graduates. This one's probably the most worrisome. This is down 4% in business management and marketing, biggest categories of degree in the United States. That, given its size, that 4% gap is actually a big reduction in job opportunities for those particular graduates. Second thing I noticed on this chart is almost all the dots are in this 1 to 5% range down, whether that's psychology down slightly or computer and information sciences down slightly. And then we get to a whole raft of things that look like they're dropping more like 4%, mechanic and repair technology, homeland security, construction and trades. And actually education is declining a little bit more rapidly than that. So we are starting to see the jobs for graduates coming down, in most cases in that 1 to 5% range. On the upside, science and tech are still hot. So that's up 4% and still promising. And you can see computer science is not really down. It's almost rounding error in terms of the amount of the decline. So tech remains a relatively safe area in terms of employment. In June, what went on? Well, we've got a few things on this chart. First, we have the program name. Then we have a bar for the number of jobs. And finally, the average wages for those jobs. And then I've color-coded it so you can pick out hospitality and healthcare jobs in this chart. And the black bars are actually other, they're things that don't fit in either of those two categories. So first thing I noticed, which surprised me, is the sheer volume of jobs in hospitality. 4 of the top 10 job fields, if you will, are in hospitality, which is quite surprising to me. I think what we're seeing here is still recovery from COVID, where many of those jobs, people were laid off and now they're having to bring them back. So that's keeping the volume of hiring here pretty high. Second is healthcare, and I was actually a little surprised not to see nursing make this chart, but medical assisting is up there in the top 10, actually third, and medical office assistant. And after that, we get to sort of a grab bag of mostly business-oriented things. Business administration, number 1 in the country in terms of total job openings. General office clerical occupations, number 4. And public administration, and finally, selling skills and sales operations, you'll see crops up several times during this data as an important area. By the way, one of the few things that's not taught as a program, generally speaking. And I've always wondered about that and whether there's an opportunity there. I don't know how many people actually aspire to become salespeople, though, and be willing to study it. Though it's the largest single occupation in the United States. So a lot of us are going to end up there, whether we're meant to be or not. What happened overall in terms of growth? Given that we're down 5%, it's not surprising to find that most things are down, but I didn't expect it to look quite like this. Among the larger programs, only 4 of them grew. And we have several big programs that are in decline here: business, pathology, health information. I was surprised to see 2 healthcare things coming down in this environment. And actually, one still growing, clinical medical laboratory assistant, excuse me. We see some more food service and hospitality in the growth area. And then a couple things that are flat here: resort management, hotel, motel. So the big thing here, though, is to only have 4 out of the 200 programs we looked at that are actually growing. So the job markets here are softening up. What fell the most? And here, the fall in healthcare jobs is quite striking. There are some of these things I've never seen fall before: registered nursing, nursing specialists. Nursing's been growing for years and years. But I think what's going on here is not that nursing is in an absolute decline, but there was a huge spike in job postings for nursing during COVID, and those are starting to soften. So we're still seeing very strong demand for nurses. It's just not as on an absolute basis, but on a percent change, it's starting to come down. And I always check the pay to see if something's in high demand and they're making $84,000. So there still remains strong demand for nurses, albeit not as much as there was shortly before. And farm tech is another big drop, I suspect, probably related to COVID. And then we see some other things that are more difficult to explain, retail ops. And although you see Walmart starting to lay people off, so that big boom we had coming out of COVID, bringing everybody back, I think in retail, that's starting to temper off. I mentioned sales skills. I think that's probably tied to things like retail ops, but decline there. Executive assistant, I'm always surprised to see this almost still exists the scale it does. It's still one of the larger job markets. General office, special products, and business and operations support. Now, let me stop there. It's a little bit about what's going on in the job market, and turn it over to Mike to talk about how they're doing this kind of work at Mesa.
Sure. Thanks, Bob. So, first I'll just preface, the data information, all that labor market data and other data we get from systems like Gray's, it's a lot, right? And so I do a lot of coaching on this sort of data, one-on-ones at my institution. And the book that they did is fantastic. I praise Bob because I read through it myself, and it puts a lot of this information into more palatable scenarios that I think is very applicable. So I'll just prep, if you're feeling like it's a lot, it's because it is. But, I think as you kind of work with it more, you make better sense of it as an administrator at community college. So, where I'm from, I'm at the largest of 10 colleges here in the Maricopa Community College District. We have a demographic that's probably comparable to a lot of folks here. Half our students are first generation. We're a Hispanic serving institution with actually a minority majority population, and we've got a good number of Pell Grant recipients. Next slide. So one of our institutional values is diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we really value diversity as a wonderful asset. We think a lot about our systems, our environments, and our interactions to promote an environment that's welcoming and engaging and supports all learners. And I feel this next thing is really important, that the completion of all of our programs, and we have a lot of them, should be a reflection of the community that we serve demographically, whether it's male, female, or different ethnicities. And we need to take some action to recruit that population because, unless you've seen yourself in a profession, you may not gravitate towards it. So we've taken a lot of intentional action, particularly with the imagery on our program pages, using the data that we have to show people who might be in that underrepresented demographic as the front face of our various programs. So I think that's a really important thing to think about, maybe putting a male person, a male on your nursing program page, maybe a female on your welding page, right? People don't see themselves in things that they've never seen people do before. Next slide. So I have to give my hats off to our institutional effectiveness office. We have a wonderful team that does amazing work with Tableau dashboards. And I now understand our student population better than I ever have before. So we have around 49,000 students, and this is as of this date, as of this week, it updates nightly. But we have around 49,000 head count of students that we're really responsible for as a community college. Now, not all students enroll every single semester, right? So these are people from the application phase to actively enrolled this summer. It was one more day of classes this summer for us. And people who are enrolled in the fall or may have been enrolled in a prior lagging semester, but are not yet disenrolled due to inactivity. And I'm sure that most of you have different types of awards. And for us, these are the major buckets that we have. So things from associate degrees to smaller workforce certificates. And then we have a bunch of people who don't declare any of our academic majors, and they're not on a pathway map, but they might have academic intent to transfer to university, but they're not declaring one of our maps, or they have academic intent to update job skills, but they're not specifically choosing a program to study with us. And there's a bunch of people who are transfer as well. So next slide. So when we looked at the data that we have, we realized that out of all those people, the majority of people have a single declared major. Some have more than one, but most have one major. We use some controls here that we call course applicability. So our financial aid team restricts the ability to leverage financial aid dollars to only those courses within the declared program of study. That's not to say the students can't take courses outside of their program of study, but in our system, that will be self-pay and not covered by financial aid. So we have a lot of assurity, certainly in the more recent years, that indeed people are taking courses that lead to completion in their declared major.
Mike, how do things like electives work in that situation?
Well, so the electives are defined, right? You know, and working with their advisor, you know, there would have to be the elective credit and the acceptable options to have the financial aid applied. And once they've utilized all their electives, you know, then financial aid would not be applied to additional elective choices. You know, our faculty created every program of study was not created by an administrator, right? The faculty did that at our institution, you know, and they should and they do have a vested interest in the success of those students, but they need to know who those students are, right? So it's a lot more intuitive for nursing faculty to know nursing students. They're in closed cohort programs, or vet tech faculty to know vet tech students. It's less intuitive for students on a history program transfer map, right? They might only take a few prefixed history courses with us and not in a cohort fashion. So it's hard to know all the time in those general education courses, who are the students who are really part of my identity as a faculty, a history faculty, and who are the people who are just there taking that course because they have some other academic intent. Let's go to the next slide. So we take a lot of time and energy and planning to align all of our programs, one, with the needs of the community, two, to really think deeply about cycles of informed improvement, you know, and really make sure that what we're offering is good for the community and good for our college. And we're a very large program or college by the number of programs. About half of all the curriculum that's offered in the Maricopa Community College system of 10 colleges is offered at this very college. And we have, you know, 2 campuses and additional large training site location, but it's a lot of stewardship, you know, and then we break that down for the community of people who come to our pages into 84 marketing pages. And that's probably our most visited area, you know, program A to Z, it's our top hit page. So they search us by how we list our programs alphabetically. Internally, we have probably around 34 occupational director leads who really have responsible for an area of occupation. More broadly, we have 23 academic departments and 8 programmatic accreditation. So whatever your portfolio mix is, understanding it in this way, you know, there's a lot of levels of complexity, and how do you get the stewardship down to the right area, you know, and people looking at the right data, you know, because large level data does nothing for no one, it does nothing for our institution, but data sifted down and filtered to the right area of action, you know, can be quite impactful. Next slide, please. Okay, so that leads into some essential things. So if you take away a few things from me, you know, it's really important that programs have stewardship, you know, and I'm talking every single one. So for us, it's 349. 349 things need an individual who provides stewardship. I'll give one example. You know, we have a networking network academy. Network Academy has 18 individual certificates and 2 degree pathways. I know I have one person who's primarily responsible for that, and they have a team of faculty. So, whether it's a lead faculty member, a program director, department chair, you need to be able to assign all that stewardship somewhere. And that includes transfer pathways, right? And that's something that we've been working at as a college. We've always had occupational identity and occupational program review, but it's been an interesting conversation for us to say 100% of everything that's on the books, whether it's a transfer or an academic certificate, needs program review and needs stewardship. And the next thing is, programs aren't static. They're born, they grow, they decline, they sunset. And in this system, it's incredibly easy. There's a low threshold for starting something new, right? And almost everything I've seen, gets a yes. And it's very hard to sunset things in this particular system, right? And that has taken a lot more intentional conversation. As a dean here, I've sunsetted or moved a few programs, but I've seen 10 times as many new things come into fruition as I've seen go away. Okay. And then program review needs to be frequent. Most community colleges will have a cycle of review that's between 3 and 5 years, and that's great. That comprehensive review is fantastic. Hopefully you have some process wrapped around that. I always see that as like hitting save on a program. So if that person, like in a former life, I was a paramedic program director, if I win the lottery or get abducted by aliens, someone can go back to that data set and move forward what needs to be moved forward. But it's better to have some sort of at least annual threshold review of key metrics on each of those programs. Can we calibrate as we go rather than realizing something big or a missed opportunity way down the road. And if you're finding all this data complex, it's because it is, and it's okay. And so I think it's important to have some systems, some smart systems. Like, I like using grays because it color codes things. It's really easy for me to understand green is good and red is not as good and yellow is somewhere in between. And our institutional effectiveness office does that the same way with a lot of the data that we may have internally. So as an administrator, the ability to see things easily to make a decision is important. Next slide. So that kind of leads into decision making, right? So decision making, whether it's a new program or something that needs to be decided as a result of program review or even in your daily operations, all those decisions ultimately have impact on enrollment, budget growth, and institutional success. At this college, we've adopted the Franklin-Covey 40X methodology, really to focus on a few big things that we really want to move the needle on, because as an administrator, there is a lot of things going on. Like today, you're focused on labor market data for an hour, and then in a little bit, you might have to deal with a student complaint, right? So in this whirlwind at this college, we're focused on improving degree transfer, right? And completion is a big mission for us. And also in resolving some of the equity gaps in terms of student success. So when we break that down into a dean level or a department level, we ask everyone to make it 1 or 2 wildly important goals and keep coming back to it on a regular basis to focus on moving that particular thing forward at a small level to hopefully move the needle at a big level. Next slide. So getting into labor market data specifically, Bob says there's a lot of sources, and there are, and you can get lost in, just what source do I use? I gotta tell you that we use 2. We used MC and Burning Glass probably the longest before we had Grays, and now it's called Lightcast. But we use Grays now, and it's very impactful for us as a system. We went from a single college piloting Grays to that having enough ROI to make it a system level investment. And now that Grays data is essential. And here's what I like about using that data set. The expertise and care that kind of goes into the data that Grays provides is much more tailored to me answering specific questions than some of the other sources, right? So I can't say enough about what's available in those systems. And it's not just about, should I start a new program or grow a program? You can use that data to really inform advisory conversations or your program directors about, hey, what's really happening in the workforce metrics? Are we getting enough completers in the region to match the openings? Is the demographic of the workforce part of the problem? And I'll give an example. I had a big conversation with several major automotive tech employers. And we looked at their workforce demographics, which were 98% male, and they have a workforce shortage. I said, well, what can we do collaboratively? You're not appealing to half the demographics that could possibly go into that role. How can we get more women into these jobs? Curriculum updates. I know that there's a lot of curriculum that needs to be updated. There's great data in these systems to tease out from the job postings in aggregate, what are the top skills? What are the certifications, industry recognized certifications that are needed for postings? Finding a way to tease that data into your data that you review for curriculum review is invaluable, because that's all, it's firsthand information. And I love this thing, advisories. We all need to have advisories, and having the right people at the table really matters. And so many advisory invites are based on who faculty or people know, but going to the source to say, who are the companies that are hiring the most right now? And as Bob showed, it changes monthly, it changes annually, right? There's new people who come to the market, others that leave. So I try to see if we can get that data in front of our program directors and reach out and say, hey, do you know that we have a program, we have an advisor, we'd love to have representation from your company here. And then I'm sure many of you also have specific conversations with individual employers. There's data that you can tease out of these, so you can be very knowledgeable about their actual workforce needs firsthand or fairly firsthand when you go and talk to them. And I use that when I go talk to like a Boeing or an Intel or a Banner Health System. They might be telling me what their needs are, but it's nice for me to kind of have in my back pocket, having seen what they posted for recently. Next slide. Now, this is a busy slide. There's a lot going on, and it's worth taking a look at. So at the end of the day, there's a lot of data, okay? And it's good to have some key tools. We happen to use Grays in one way, Tableau in another way, and a system that ties into a learning management system called Dropout Detective. And so having some tools, but then also collaborating. The Tableau is owned and managed by our institutional effectiveness office, right? So the deans of instruction works very closely with them on a lot of different reports out of Tableau. Our e-learning department manages the Canvas learning system and manages the access to Dropout Detective. So, and as far as Grays locally, well, our district office and workforce does a lot of the high level data gathering from Grays and other systems for our program viability studies. But within my dean's office, I have people and myself that can pull out individual reports from Grays. So as I look at these three systems at our college, the dean's office is probably the power users for Gray Associates. IE is definitely the power developers for Tableau, and we're a power user of Tableau. And then the e-learning stuff is Dropout Detective. But figure out your tools, and having too many of them is cumbersome, but not enough is also a problem. You have to look at the complex data of managing things from several different angles. Next slide. And I'll leave you with this. So I'm going to just share one example in one short video so you can hear a little bit about students and impact. So in this region, in Phoenix, Arizona, we've been growing a lot in smart factories, a lot of employers like Intel have been growing operations. TSMC, which is another chip manufacturer, has been growing. We have CMC Steel. We have lots of things. And so there's been a regional investment in robotics and smart factories and automation. And that was spearheaded by the Arizona Commerce Authority to, one, bring more companies like that in and allow existing companies to grow. And then private companies have also made significant investments. So what that yielded for Mesa was at least $2 million in capital investment to build a state-of-the-art robotics and automation lab. But it's not always, if you build it, they will come, right? It may be a huge labor market need, but it still is a sell sometimes to get students to do the program. So we have made really wonderful gains in recruiting underserved groups and populations. We have still a lot more work to do to bring females into that field of work, or into that workforce. We have done a lot to improve the success of Hispanic students, but we have not made as much gains in other minority demographics and with females. But earlier I just talked about putting the face of what you're wanting to attract into your marketing imagery. So Bob, if you can play this video, it's about 50 seconds, and then I'll turn it back to you. Oh, I think you have to hit enable content, Bob. And if it doesn't work, I'll just send the link and we can share it later. Not a big deal. Oh, there we go. Yeah, but now we're not getting audio. Not a big deal. We'll just send a link out with the deck later on.
Working on it. If you want to stay current in the way society's changing, everything is autonomous. It's a great background to have. I've taken the classes to do the programming that will program the robots on a assembly line. Robots that maybe will count how many pieces pass a certain sensor. Through Mesa, the certificate class only takes about 2 years to do. But by the end of it, you are really prepared to go work at a facility like Boeing or Intel. You don't need a 4-year degree anymore to be able to work at places like that. They will give you all the training you need to start your career right away.
Thanks, Bob, for getting that done. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you all for your time. I'm going to turn it back over to Bob, and this is a lot of fun. Thank you.
Real quickly before Mike, we let you go, we have a question from Daniel. We have 587 programs, UG, AE, CE, 10 areas of study, 92 academic departments. How does someone evaluate and shift a portfolio of this size?
That's an awesome question. I'm going to start with, for one, it's just an absolute responsibility that like you, if you have 500 things and I have 300 things, it's super easy to create it, and we need to really go back and say, at the institution, who owns all of this, right? And we recently have been working on this in the last year. And we run into some challenges, like who owns some of these general AA degrees with an emphasis in communication, right? So I hear what you're saying. All of it needs review, and everything needs to be reviewed on a cycle. So if you find that you have gaps, it's just an obligation that we have to the consumer, right? To make sure that the program is providing value and that it's still relevant. I'll just share one thing from our system. I encountered when I first arrived here 6 years ago, we had programs of study that we didn't offer all the courses. We relied on people to pick up classes from sister colleges. And I said, no, that's not okay. It's our obligation. We're the ones who are HLC accredited. So if we don't have the wherewithal to stand up every course in the sequence that we say that's, that it needs to be done, then we don't have any business offering so many different programs. Some of these might need to be sunset. And what I will say, having so many programs, you kind of cannibalize your own enrollment, right? You're offering too many choices, and that's why sometimes you might have low enrollment sections. Happy to chat with you more offline or afterwards.
Yeah, I think there's another dimension to that too, which is in order to handle a portfolio of that size, you've got to automate the data collection, or else you're going to be forced to anecdote by just the sheer weight of the time it takes to evaluate a program. And nobody has it. The evaluations are done in an inconsistent way using inconsistent data sources, which makes it very difficult to interpret. So automation is a big part of the answer to how you deal with that kind of volume. And I thought I'd share with you, I picked one auto tech classic program at many community colleges. These are auto mechanics training, big field, reasonably well paid, and just share with you how you can look at the market for a program. As Mike mentioned, we're all color coded. So green is good, pink is bad. Dark green means you're at the 98th percentile or higher. And you can see this one's up at the 96th percentile, 97th percentile in student demand. You might say percentile of what, which is a good question. We actually compare each program to all 1,400 other programs that are listed in iPads. So where you have 587, chances are not every one of them is going to be in here because you probably got a few strange zip codes or things that you offer. But the vast majority are going to be in here. They're already, the market's going to be pre-evaluated for you. You can customize the scoring. You can come in and see how that program is doing fairly quickly. So again, you could look at student demand just at a glance and see it's green and know you're probably okay. You can dive
just so everybody knows, we are going to go in depth into student demand on Bootcamp number 2. So what Bob's going to talk about here is a really great lead in to Zach's presentation, along with, I believe, Berkshire Community College next week. So at what we're showing you here, you're going to get really more even in depth to next time.
Right. And here you can see this, the employment, the direct prep, which I told you about the issues, but for something like auto tech, people who study auto tech are probably going to become auto tech. So it's reasonably accurate. All dark green, all 95th percentile or higher. I've got wages that I can look at and see it ranges from 31 to 51. A little bit better when you look at what happens in the American Community Survey, age 30 to 60, creeps all the way up to $81,000. My guess is at that point, they're in one of the better auto dealers. And they're also they're paid essentially on a commission for the number of pieces processed. So if you're a good, fast auto mechanic, you can actually make a pretty good living. So the other things, though, we got competition and so forth. We'll talk about it another time. But let me take you in another dimension of the answer to that is you've got to have a reasonable way of looking at all your programs at once. So this is what we call our program dashboard. And this, if you will, would be what a VP of academic administration might look at to be able to get a quick sense of how all the programs are doing at their institution. And so I've got a program here, it's accounting. I can quickly see how it's doing in terms of Google search volumes, which we'll talk about next week, job posting volumes, median size, and so forth, including enrollment, all the way over to how it does on a cost basis compared to benchmark. And in any one of these things, I go in and say, okay, how's it trending? And sort the whole data set, in this case, about 150 programs, and see where the job postings are high. I could come over and see where the changes are, and I can see whether my enrollment's up or down. So getting through a few hundred programs requires some automated tools to be able to do that effectively. And I think the color coding is really important too, so you can look at these things at a glance and not have to really look across an entire row of numbers for each of 500 programs to understand what's hot and what's not. Mike, there is a request to see an actual CTE program from Mesa. If you want to bring one up on the screen, you're welcome to. I'll turn it over to you. Or we can do that. Maybe just do that offline and send that one.
Yeah, we probably do that offline. Just say I don't have Gray's dialed up right now.
Yeah, Ron, I would be happy to connect you with Mike to get you that. Mike, we do have another question. I think you have a couple fans here in this in chat, but when conversations related to sunsets can be heated and have involvement, how do you involve faculty? Also, just so everybody knows, that will be covered in class 4 of this bootcamp now, but it's always good to hear from people who live it.
That's a great question, and I think one, what doesn't work is, behind closed doors, run all the data, and then, go out and deliver bad news. That doesn't work. And so I think, if you can create a data informed culture, right? And I'll share, like we're a pretty good college at this, but, Lone Star Community College has a data camp, and they have their whole college community looking at data resources like this. And I think it's less scary when people understand the why. And it's not like all of a sudden, if they can see the decline or see the change and see why we might need to do something different, it's less scary. And in this system, I'll give two examples. We had an architecture program when I started, which had very, very few declared majors. I mean, empirically, there was less than 20 majors left, and there was almost no courses offered anymore. And so even though we had a faculty member who was teaching there, we could retrain that person and move them into a very similar construction management program, utilize those skills in drafting classes. But there wasn't really a need to maintain that program of study because it was no longer serving, architecture had moved way past the ability for someone with 2 years of training to have a viable pathway to a job. We're a little bit blessed here that we have a community of 10 colleges. Another one is, there's three interior design programs in this system, 2 of which were 10 miles apart. And so we were fighting each other for enrollment. So we basically created an East Valley Center of Excellence by Mesa giving up all of our declared majors. They were kind of equivalent size, but why not co-locate them, concentrate the faculty in one area, right? And that created space for us to do something different, right, in those existing facilities. So a little different, there's some nuances if you're part of a district system versus a single college. What do you do? But I'd be happy to chat more with you later on.
And what I'm starting to put up on the screen here is just an example of the kind of data that you can get from a variety of systems. Actually, this happens to be ours. And you can see, job postings, total volumes, how they're changing over time down here, which degree levels are in demand. Interestingly, very high proportion of high school. In this case, 44%. I've picked a particular geography, in this case, Phoenix. If we were working with you on the system I showed you just a moment ago, you'd actually be looking at the particular market that we had designed together and customized for you. So if you serve a market 30 miles around your campus, we'd be pulling data for 30 miles around your campus. And we probably give you a couple other market definitions as well. For example, your state, maybe a region, especially if you're offering things online. So, and within this, there are a few things Mike mentioned. This is one of my favorites. You're trying to pick the folks you want to go talk to in your market. Here's a list of the largest employers in the market, 2 seconds. And if I wanted to do that by some sort of occupation code, I could come in here. Well, I'm gonna do it by occupation. Let me do it by SIP. Say I want to look at the ones that are going to hire my accounting graduates. So I'm going to take accounting, and then I'm going to be able to see who are the biggest employers I might want to be talking to in those councils. So I make sure I'm including the views really not just of whoever the professor is, but of the people who are really hiring in the marketplace. Interestingly, the state of Arizona is the biggest hiring of accountants in the state. So it's a very heavy public market in this case.
Mike, we have a quick question where somebody says there's a lot of jobs in our local market and for local employers, but there's no students that want to actually do those jobs. How are those conversations handled in your area?
Well, I tell you what, that's one of the hardest things to do. I have the same issue with trying to get people into insurance studies, actually with that automation program. So we've been doing a lot of incentivizing, with those markets. So, occasionally we get some grant funded dollars. We found that with some of the smaller certificate programs that are sort of quick start with Intel, for example, we've allocated some regional dollars to offset the cost of tuition. So once they complete the program of study and any industry recognized credential that might go with it, then they get a full reimbursement. But they have to have money on the front end to go through, and that has worked awesome. And we've had, local employers with some, I have more employers than I know what to do with wanting that automated industrial technology program. So, and related programs. So the local employers have stood up specific scholarship opportunities for populations to enroll in those programs. And we've also had our local towns and cities make similar investments. It's super competitive right now for certain workforce areas. And I'll get off my soapbox in 1 second, but even the conversation with Boeing, a fantastically awesome opportunity, but it requires people to be in person doing physical work. And post-COVID, those people are really hard to find, right? And so, the employers are not going to be able to use the strategies that they used in the past to attract talent, but it's much cheaper for them to set up a scholarship or pay the tuition, right, to grow a pipeline than it is to invest in all those ZipRecruiter things and try to steal talent from each other, which won't actually be successful. So it's got to be about growing the pool. And, it's a different, I have another tool that I use, I won't mention here. I have a marketing tool to drive interest. It's like the Zillow or Kelly Blue Book for driving interest into community college training programs. We use that a lot to drive specific interest. If anyone wants to hear about that, they can talk to me offline.
Thanks so much, Mike. I thought I'd give you a summary of what we've just learned. First, a labor market data system is not a program evaluation system. And over the course of these workshops, we'll go over the other components of a system, which, by the way, is more than just data. It's more than software. It includes, as Mike mentioned, the process you need to use, whether it's to start a program, to manage a portfolio, or to sunset a program. Typical labor market data analysis by academic program is seriously flawed, as are BLS employment forecasts. So just be very careful with that. And as you become more expert, ask the right questions so you can make sure whether you're looking at valid data or not. Job postings have begun to decline even in healthcare, but remain well above pre-COVID levels. As Mike mentioned, each academic program needs stewardship. That steward is the person who's going to make sure that you're in alignment with employment markets, and in fairness, should be the person who comes forward and tells you when you need something new, and equally important, when you should be dropping something. And watch out on labor market data. It is key, and it changes really fast. As a result, you need automated, data-informed, and much more frequent reviews than most folks typically have. Just one more thing I wanted to tell you before we go, which is I hope you'll come back. Labor market or employment data is only one piece of the puzzle, and we'll be turning to student demand. It's super important because student demand is the best predictor of your margins. It correlates very highly with margins. So if you don't know about student demand, you're going to tend to offer things that may not actually appeal to students and fill your classrooms. Next class is Thursday, August 11th from 2 to 3. And again, that will be followed by one on the 18th and one on the 25th. So every Thursday in August, 2 to 3. Thank you all very much.
We will see you next week.